Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. I want to comment and review a comment on a video by Brian Holdsworth called Can a Cardinal Correct the Pope? Sneak peek. The answer is actually yes, a cardinal can correct the Pope. In fact, you, even if you're a layman watching this show right now, you can correct the Pope. No doubt about it. And I don't know anybody who would dispute that, but I do certainly want to establish that. However, I am going to review this video because I think that there are some points that certainly need to be addressed in this discussion. It comes up again because of the situation with Pope Francis and Cardinal Burke. Now, some have been bringing up the issue about Pope Francis revoking some apartment privileges. Of Cardinal Burke in Rome. Turns out there's actually a a development to this story that I don't think most people are aware of. It actually turns out Pope Francis did not kick out Cardinal Burke from his apartment in Rome. He is still able to stay there. The difference is Pope Francis is simply not paying for his rent effectively. Cardinal Burke has to pay full price. He won't receive it at a subsidized rate. And just to clarify again, the cardinal is not homeless and broke. There are plenty of people who thought that the Pope literally kicked the cardinal out on the street with no place to stay and no money. They honestly thought that the Pope made the cardinal homeless and that he was now broke and stranded. And that's laughably not true, given that the cardinal has multiple locations to stay, in addition to certainly means to provide for himself. But yeah, there is that kind of plot twist to the story that I don't think most people have heard about. So we'll briefly review that today as it comes up in the video that I am going to be reviewing from Brian. The video was done 3 days ago. Again, it's called Can a Cardinal Correct the Pope? Just some preliminary thoughts about this. I certainly appreciate anybody who wants to offer a valuable contribution to these discussions. That's certainly welcome and helpful. What I do find interesting, though, is let's say you have two people who are discussing how to properly translate a very important verse from the New Testament. So we're translating from Koine Greek into, say, English. And it's something that's really, really important. And we want to make sure we're getting it right, because otherwise, if we get this thing wrong, it could be heretical and it could really harm a lot of people. Perhaps we're talking about a translation that is going to be read by millions and millions of people. And so if we don't get this thing right, we could lead millions of people into very, very grave error. Okay, so let's say we're discussing some of the issues involved in translating a particular phrase in a certain verse of the New Testament. And somebody else kind of walks up, comes along and says, "What are you guys doing? This is kind of silly. I mean, don't you know the King James Version was good enough for Paul? And if it's good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me." And then they just think that that kind of settles the debate. I think we would probably all agree that, all right, well, if somebody did that, I mean, God bless their heart, but they're not ready for this discussion. Perhaps they need to look a little bit more into it, and then they'll appreciate the debate that is taking place. I kind of feel like that's what happens when you give, if you were to give that person who is saying that comment about the KJV, if you were to give them a YouTube channel, that's kind of what is happening here, unfortunately, with Brian Holdsworth. I mean, he has other things that are helpful that he has contributed to all kinds of discussions. But when it comes to this one, I kind of feel like the contributions that he added to the discussion just muddied the waters, because he unfortunately fails to appreciate the basic parameters of the discussion, and then raises a false dichotomy, and then brings a solution that really is no solution to the real debate. And then at the end, accuses people of hypocrisy in the discussion. And I'm just left scratching my head thinking, what's going on here? If we're going to accuse people of hypocrisy, we at the very least need to make sure we're understanding what the discussion actually is before we go out and do that. So that's what I want to review. And oddly enough, I mean, this isn't unique to just Brian's perspective. This kind of lack of appreciation for the discussions that are taking place right now surrounding dissent, papal heresy, things like that. The perspective that Brian is coming from really is reflective of the vast majority of comments I see in the comment section. I'll see people who think that what's being discussed here is whether or not you can criticize the Pope, and that is the way that Brian frames it, and that is not at all in discussion here. To my knowledge, nobody is actually debating that, and nor should they, because that one's a pretty simple answer. Yes, you could criticize the Pope, and even publicly, of course. That's no. I'll see that a lot, though, in the comment section. People will frame the discussion in that way when it's clearly a discussion that's much more complex than that. Or I'll hear people say, look, the case of Pope Honorius or John the 22nd clearly shows a Pope can teach heresy. And it's like, yeah, it's a little bit more complex than that. There's a little bit more going on, not only with those historical cases, but there's a little bit more going on with the discussion surrounding papal heresy. Just simply throwing out John 22nd or Pope Honorius, again, is reminiscent of the guy who comes along and just says, hey, the KJV was good enough for Paul, therefore it should be good enough for us. And it's just like, no, it's a little bit more complex than that. Or, I'll see also in the comment section, people say, well, Paul clearly corrected Peter, and they think that settles it. Or appeal to St. Thomas, who speaks about how we can correct a superior, the different ways in which we can and can't correct a superior. And that's unfortunately what Brian resorted to here. And something I see very, very common. But once again, it just kind of reminds me of that scenario with the KJV comments. And it just, doesn't fully appreciate and grasp what is taking place here. Hopefully I can help shed some light on it. I know I've been doing that with show after show after show, but I can clearly see by the comments that I'm getting, by how other YouTubers are reacting to the stuff, I can clearly see they're not watching the content or failing to understand it if they are watching the content. And so what I've been doing on this channel doesn't seem to be something that the average commenter has really digested, because I'm still getting feedback that really isn't reflective of the discussions that are taking place. And so hopefully this will help clarify what it is that we are talking about, what we're not talking about when it comes to papal heresy, when it comes to criticism of the Pope or Pope Francis or Cardinal Burke. That's what I'm going to try to achieve with this video. Let's maybe start with the very beginning here with a just factual comment. I'm not even going to play a clip of it just because it's such a short part, but at the 30-second mark, he speaks about Cardinal Burke having no assignment right now. To my knowledge, that's actually not accurate. And this is where I think a lot of people are misinformed. He was removed from the head of the Apostolic Signatura a while back. That is true. He was removed. However, in 2017, Pope Francis brought him back, not as the head of the Apostolic Signatura, but as a member on it. And to my knowledge, he still is on it. So he does still have an assignment there. Now, of course, he doesn't have any diocese or, something like that. And so he's not a shepherd anywhere in particular. But yes, he is still a member of the Apostolic Signatura. Now, let's go to the 1 minute mark, where he's just going to briefly comment about the question of Pope Francis and the papal apartments. Let's just kind of briefly look at that section because I want to show you some updates on this. All right, here we go. Sorry, let me take it off 2 times speed. I always forget. So we're going to go to the 1 minute mark here. There we go.
That once their tasks are completed, and as many of them are advanced in age, they are then allowed to enjoy something like a retirement. So they're given like a pension and living provisions. And it seems to me that that's what was going on with Cardinal Burke. But now, more recently, just this week, rumors started to circulate that the Pope was going to revoke those as a kind of punishment towards Burke, which we'll get into perhaps the potential reasons for that. And a lot of people saying that there's no way that this is possible. This can't be true. And then eventually it did come to light that they were true and that they were confirmed. And so now, of course, the debate erupts. And I'm not.
All right. And again, there are some updates to it. It turns out this is exactly why I'm very guarded against rumors. I ultimately just commented on this whenever we confirmed through Austin Ivory what the Pope did actually say. But you'll note that even in that interview, this particular plot twist that we're going to observe here wasn't actually addressed. So, yeah, this is why I am so cautious with those who constantly promote these kinds of rumors. Anonymous cardinal says, and this is what Pope Francis said behind closed doors, and he said that Cardinal Burke is his enemy, and turns out Pope Francis actually explicitly denies that and says, no, I never said that, he's not my enemy, and so on. And so, yeah, this is why we just have to be very careful. But let's look at the plot twist here, because there is a development. You should be able to see it on your screen. This is from the Pillar. Cardinal Burke notified of Vatican apartment changes. This was December 3rd, so 2 days ago, around 6 p.m. So Cardinal Raymond Burke received notice Friday that he must soon begin paying market rate rent on his Vatican apartment or vacate the residence in early 2024. So in other words, he was not kicked out. He just simply now has to pay the full price on it instead of it being subsidized. Why did Pope Francis do this? Well, because he said that Cardinal Burke is using his position in the church to be divisive and to create disunity within the church. Even though that may not be his intention, it's still the byproduct of some of his actions. I did a video where I walked us through all kinds of evidence demonstrating that, since Cardinal Burke, again, without the intention, I'm sure, without the intention of trying to promote dissent, still nevertheless does just that by explicitly rejecting the authoritative teachings of various magisterial teachings as well as disciplinary decisions. And he tells people that this is not authoritative. You don't have to assent to it, or this is not actually within the authority of the church, so you don't have to obey it. And so it turns out, well, since those things that he's rejecting are authoritative and they are disciplines that the Pope can impose, what the cardinal is unintentionally doing is he is promoting dissent and telling people to dissent against lawful acts of the governing authority of the church as well as teachings of the church. That's a very serious matter. And so I could totally understand maybe the frustrations with Pope Francis on this issue, since this has been taking place as early as 2015. So about 8 years now. I can understand his frustration, and frankly, just simply telling him he needs to pay his apartment at full price instead of it being subsidized by the Vatican, that's a little slap on the wrist. But you'll notice what happens is whenever the papal critics get slapped on the wrist, they cry foul, they pass out, they pretend that they're dying, they raise a stink, a massive commotion. However, it's interesting, the same papal critics can take shots at Pope Francis, stab him in the back, slice his face, cut his throat, and nobody bats an eye. I'm just pointing out the difference there. But okay, let's continue, however, with more the substance of this video, because the substance of what Brian is trying to do here isn't so much to address the issue of the Vatican apartment. That's just kind of mentioned in passing. The substance of this is to say, look, here is an issue where it looks like there's a contradiction between two sides. He sets up a false dichotomy, but he says, here's these two sides. Looks like they're contradicting themselves. And here I have a solution from St. Thomas, and that settles the matter, and you guys are hypocrites. That's what we're going to see from Brian. And so that's kind of what I want to review. Let's go to the 2 minute, 27 minute mark where we can see this begin to emerge. Let me share my screen so we can watch it together.
With church council excerpts or canon law excerpts, while the others have their own excerpts that they fling in isolation of these ones, and it just kind of goes back and forth. And there needs to be some way to reconcile all of these apparently competing statements that might appear within councils and canon law. Otherwise, you end up with an ecclesiology that contradicts itself. And of course, I don't think anybody would agree that that's the case. So
All right, so Brian, as we're going to see in the video in a moment, he sets up a straw man. He misrepresents both sides, really, and seems to say, "Look, this side is saying this, and it's using these councils and these canons, and this side is saying this, and it's using these councils and it's these canons," and he doesn't understand either side. And then he says, "And look, it looks like they're contradicting each other, but surely they can't. Both sides would agree there can't be a contradiction," and he's going to offer us a solution, one that does not at all solve the real debate. It might solve the straw man that he created, but not the real debate. Now, I want to say, but yeah, bingo, spot on. There has to be something that could solve these disputes that are taking place in the church, right? Because there are disputes that are taking place. We have to agree. Whether Brian understands what those disputes are is a different question. But we could all agree with Brian that there are disputes in the church. And so, okay, you have these disputes, and you have some people bringing up certain canons and certain councils, and you have others bringing up other canons and other councils. And he says, there has to be some kind of way to solve this. Bingo. That's where I come in. And I've been pointing people to all along. That solution is the magisterium. And that's why we're Catholics and not Protestants or Eastern Orthodox. Because that is exactly what Protestants are struggling with in Eastern Orthodox. They have different canons, different councils, different theologies, and they're throwing it at each other, and they don't know how to solve that tension and provide solutions. And I say, wait, Christ did give us a solution. It's the magisterium. And so what I've been doing on this channel is saying, yeah, stop listening to just one side over the other. Listen to what the magisterium says to resolve these debates, because it's the magisterium, the teaching authority of the church, that has that authority to settle these disputes. And in the disputes that are taking place, the magisterium has already settled the disputes. So what I try to do is just point people to what the magisterium itself has said. But unfortunately, many of us Catholics, we're just ignorant of what the church teaches. We might not even know that there is a magisterium. I mean, it's that severe at some points. And so I'm trying to help offset that and catechize people and show them that, yeah, there is a solution here. Listen to what the church teaches. It's already solved this dispute. Okay, so let's go to the 3-minute mark, and we're going to see the way that Brian frames the question. And the way he frames the question shows that he doesn't understand what's actually being debated here. Again, hearkening back to the KJV only comments. It's very much akin to that. Let me show it to you. We're going to see it repeatedly throughout the video.
I started asking myself this fundamental question, which is related to what degree can a person or a subject criticize a superior within the church? In the case of the Pope, can a bishop or a cardinal correct or criticize the Pope? Because that seems to be the lightning rod and the focal point of Cardinal Burke. He is famous for having signed on to a dubia in the past in which they asked the Pope for clarification for some doctrinal concerns around communion for the divorced and remarried. They didn't get a response from that. And then they eventually issued a fraternal correction saying that if this is how it's being interpreted, that's not quite right. And here's what the constant teaching of the church is. And there are some.
All right, so couple things going on here. Here's where he's factually mistaken as far as them not getting a response to the dubia. As I've brought out multiple times, it turns out Pope Francis, with this dubia that was sent to him by Cardinal Burke and a few others back in 2016, related to questions with Amoris Laetitia, Not only were the questions unnecessary because they were already answered in Amoris Laetitia, but be that as it may, they submit these questions to the Pope, and when they didn't get a response, they go straight to the news reporters and started to, um, uh, put public pressure on the Pope to respond. And here's what actually happened, though. It's not as if the Pope received these dubia and he says, I don't like this. They're catching me, in a conundrum here, and I don't want them to expose my false theology, so I'm not going to respond to this. Rather than that being what happened, because that's often the narrative that we hear, Pope Francis found out about the dubia not from having received it from the cardinals, but from the news. Yeah. The first time Pope Francis heard of it was when they had already gone to the news. He had not even received the dubia yet and seen it. Now, giving the benefit of the doubt to the cardinals, perhaps they had submitted it and the Pope had not just reviewed it yet, did not realize he had it yet. Maybe there's some breakdown in communication there. Okay. But the Pope had not even seen the thing, had not even been aware of it yet, before he found out from the news. And it's then all over the news that these cardinals are correcting the Pope and this and that. And, there were accusations of the Pope teaching heresy and the cardinals are exposing that. And can you imagine being Pope Francis in that situation and you don't even find out about this by actually receiving the dubia? The way you find out about it is through public pressure on social media and through the news. I could totally understand why Pope Francis felt that that was inappropriate, especially when it's contrary to Dona Veritatis. And unfortunately, this isn't the first time that Burke did this. He went on to do it again this year, 2023. He did the exact same thing. Well, I say exact, a little bit different. In this particular case, Pope Francis did receive their dubia in July of 2023 this year. He did respond to it the very next day. I mean, talk about prompt. The Pope responded to their dubia the next day. They didn't like the answers that they were given, so they submitted another dubia. And the Pope has not yet responded to that, and frankly shouldn't, because it is incredibly unnecessary and raises deeper concerns for the fact that they're still asking more questions that have already been answered. Now, whenever he didn't respond to the second dubia, that's when they resorted once again to public pressure, rushed to social media 2 days before the Synod on Synodality began. And we had all kinds of chaos that erupted into the church, because then people twisted some of the things in the original dubia response from Pope Francis. And yeah, chaos erupted. I've documented all that at length. And it was a fiasco. And not only was this a fiasco in Catholic media, but also in secular news. There were all kinds of false reports. Pope Francis opens the door to blessing gay unions, just all kinds of absolute lies and slanders. So I could understand why Pope Francis said, hey, he feels like whether Burke realizes it or not, he's being divisive to the unity of the church, because at the end of the day, net result, dissenting from the magisterium and constantly putting pressure on the magisterium through social media. Yeah, that is disruptive to the unity of the church. Okay, but let's continue here. With this point, he frames it as, can a cardinal correct or criticize the Pope? They're not the same thing. He conflates those two, but they're not the same thing. Criticizing and correcting are not the same. However, the answer to that question, to both actually, to those questions is yes. He can both criticize and correct a Pope. Obviously, in the sense that I think Brian is promoting in the video, not a correction as if the cardinal is a superior to the Pope, certainly not in that sense, but rather as an inferior in charity, pointing to an error in his superior. In that sense, of course, a cardinal and even a layman can correct the Pope. We have no doubt. I have no doubt about that. I don't know anybody who's really disputing that. And again, the question of criticizing the Pope. Yes, you can criticize the Pope. I don't know who's disputing that. Maybe they're out there. And some people are actually saying you can't criticize the Pope. Brian certainly seems to think that these people are out there, and certainly seems to think that they're very prevalent on social media. I have never encountered such a person. But then again, I've never encountered the entire internet, so maybe I'm missing something here. Maybe there's somebody out there. Um, but in my opinion, I think what's more likely is not that these people are out there and I just haven't encountered them. I think it's actually more likely he's misunderstanding the parameters of the discussion, because that becomes very apparent throughout the video. He seems to think that people are saying that you can't criticize the Pope or even correct the Pope. No, that's not what's being said. That's not what's being said. What's actually being discussed is, can you publicly dissent from authoritative teachings of the Pope? That's one. Dissent is not the same as correcting or criticizing. Not the same thing. Very important that we understand differences here. Dissent is going to be you're authoritatively teaching something with the voice of Christ. Even if it's non-infallible, it's still the voice of Christ per Pope Pius XII in Humani Generis. You're teaching something with the voice of Christ. It's authoritative. It's binding on my conscience. I am to give religious submission of intellect and will to it. But I'm going to refuse to do that. Not only am I not going to give religious submission of intellect and will to what you're teaching, but I'm also going to publicly tell people that you're wrong with this teaching and people don't have to assent to it. That is dissent. Where did we really begin to see this from? In the modern period. And what I mean by modern period, let me rephrase that. In recent period, I should say, in the post-conciliar period, we saw that from the German bishops rejecting Humanae Vitae. They were the first ones to engage in this kind of public dissent, where the Pope taught against artificial contraception. German bishops came and said, nah, you can actually dissent, and you can start to see that whole movement erupt. And unfortunately, it's kind of bled over into people on the other end of the spectrum who do hold to Humanae Vitae, who don't reject it. But likewise, just like the German bishops did with Humanae Vitae, they are now dissenting against all kinds of papal authoritative teachings, whether they are actually papal or even just conciliar, both actually. So again, I feel like maybe Brian isn't aware of some of the basic distinctions in this discussion, the difference between dissent or criticism or correction. And so I think that that's a crucial point we need to take note of. Now I am going to do a whole show in depth on the question of dissent. I know I've done multiple shows where I've touched on it, but I'm going to do something much more exhaustive in the near future. And I'm going to show explicitly through multiple magisterial teachings that you cannot publicly dissent from magisterial teachings. At the very most, you can privately withhold assent from some non-definitive teachings, at the most. And yes, you can express some concerns, you can express criticisms, and you can even do that publicly, as I've documented on this show many, many times. The church does allow that, but that is not the same as publicly dissenting from the magisterium. Okay, so let's go to the 3-minute 42-second mark, where Brian seems to think there is precedent for what is taking place in these current discussions with the case of, take a wild guess, John the 22nd. You guessed it. All right, let's go ahead and watch it.
Some people who have responded to that saying, you can't do that. You can't correct the Pope. He's the supreme head of the church. He's infallible. No one judges the Pope. But then, of course, there are examples from church history in which popes have been corrected and even been found guilty of material heresy, which is distinct from formal heresy. Formal heresy is manifest, persistent public heresy, where even though a correction has been made, the heretic persists in that heresy. Material heresy is when you say something that isn't quite right, or you teach something that isn't quite right, but you don't necessarily know that it's not quite right. And so when if it becomes a controversial statement or teaching, there might be a council that is convened or just some magisterial oversight in which a clarification is made, at which point the person who was teaching whatever was wrong has the opportunity to correct themselves. And if they do, then it was mere material heresy. But if they insist on persisting in it, then it becomes formal heresy.
Okay, actually, it's the next part where he mentions John the 22nd to substantiate this. But let me briefly comment on this part because it proves exactly what I just said, and that is Brian doesn't understand the basic parameters of the discussion, because you'll notice what he just did is he referred to judging the Pope, and he conflated that with correcting and criticizing the Pope. All right, there are 4 terms here that we need to make sure we're very, very clear on, because none of them are carry the same meaning. There are 4 terms being used here, and I'm seeing them being conflated by almost everyone online. Judging, dissenting, correcting, criticizing. Those are 4 different terms. We're seeing 3 of those terms explicitly being conflated by Brian, and actually the 4th implied. It seems that he's there are 4th of those. It's implied that he's conflating it as well. And I see this just online every day long. I'll talk about how the canon law, or even the 8th Ecumenical Council, in the constant canonical tradition of the church, and many other things in the church's magisterium, tells us that the first see, that is Rome, is judged by no one. I'll mention that, and then I'll get a 1,000 people in the comment section. Oh, then this is a recipe for tyranny, and it's like, wait, hold on. Jesus instituted an institution that's a recipe for tyranny? Wait, I missed something here. But they say, this is a recipe for tyranny. You should be able to criticize the Pope. There's nothing wrong with criticizing the Pope. There's nothing wrong with correcting the Pope. There's nothing wrong with dissent. And it's like, wait, we're missing the basics of this discussion here. Judging the Pope is going to be, it can be understood in multiple senses. Number one, it could be in reference to I'm somehow sitting in judgment of your magisterium. I'm somehow over your magisterium. There were some who thought that maybe like councils were greater than the Pope's teaching authority, the heresy of conciliarism. And they thought that in that sense, a Pope could be judged, a council could be convened and could sit in judgment over the Pope, and the Pope has to submit to the council. All right, there's that sense of judgment, to which the church has said, no, that's actually heresy. No, the Pope doesn't actually have to submit in judgment to a council. It's rather the other way around. The council would submit in judgment to the Pope. There is a very, very minor exception to that with Haec Sancta, with the Council of Constance, where if it's unclear who the Pope is, then the claimant of the papacy would be subject to the council, only because it's unclear who the Pope is. Now, if we knew who the Pope was, then obviously it's not subject to the council, right? That's the only exception there. Okay, so judgment in that sense, absolutely prohibited. That's heresy to say that any kind of authority sits in judgment of the Pope. You could also speak of judging the Pope in the sense of perhaps just simply publicly criticizing or correcting the Pope. If that's what you mean by judge the Pope, there's a lot going on here. You can publicly criticize the Pope per Canon 212, but that's not exactly the same historically when we refer to the concept of judging the Pope. So I would just avoid conflating those terms. I would reserve judgment for some other nuances. And I would just simply say, yes, you can criticize the Pope. It does need to be done in charity, but you can do so, and you can even do so publicly, which is why I've done so publicly here on this channel on occasion. Canon 212 does allow for us to do that. I've often cited Canon 212 as justification for publicly criticizing the Pope. It doesn't need to be something flippant. It doesn't need to be something that you're constantly doing. You need to be very hesitant to do it. But I've personally offered some criticisms of Traditionis Custodes, for instance, or some criticisms of some prudential matters related to Pope Francis's judgment on the death penalty. or just maybe perhaps the way Pope Francis has reacted to or not reacted to certain situations in the church. Okay. So criticism, yes, keep it respectful, be charitable, be hesitant to do it. But yes, criticism. But don't conflate that with judging. Now, judging could also mean this, rather than the notion of I'm somehow legally sitting in judgment against the Pope because I'm somehow some higher authority. Judgment could also refer to a lower authority publicly opposing and rejecting a teaching of the Pope. Now, in that particular case, I don't like using the term judge. I just like using the term dissent. I think that helps clarify some things a little bit better. But I will note the Eighth Ecumenical Council, in discussing the question of judging the Pope, is not limiting the term merely to somehow there's this authority that is greater than the Pope sitting in judgment of the Pope. No, it even notes this concept of judging the Pope that is forbidden includes composing or compiling writings or tracts against the most holy Pope of Elder Rome with the excuse that he is charged of heresy, whether in writing or otherwise. And if you do so, it notes here, this is what Photius recently did, and Dioscorus likewise a long time ago. Anyone who shows such arrogance and rashness as to utter insults against the see of Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, whether in writing or otherwise, as Photius and Dioscorus did, is to receive a condemnation that is equal and identical to theirs. What was that condemnation? It was anathema. Okay. Why do I bring this up? Just because there are some people saying, well, look, Photius and Dioscorus assembled in an actual council. And what they did is they were assembling in a council, sitting in judgment of the Pope. And this is all it's doing here. All that the council is saying is that you can't be a council in judgment of the Pope. That's not all Photius and Dioscorus did. They also composed and wrote tracts against the Holy Father, accusing him of heresy. And the council in Canon 21, which is what I just read to you, is prohibiting that as well. Okay, so it's not merely an issue of, you can't judge the Pope, meaning you can't sit in some kind of council and think that your council is more authoritative than him. That's not entirely what's taking place. You can't even write or compose tracts, writing or otherwise, accusing the Pope of heresy. That's also judging the Pope. And that is also prohibited according to Canon 28 of the Eighth Ecumenical Council. But that is, again, not the same as publicly criticizing the Pope or even publicly correcting the Pope. You could offer a correction without accusing the Pope of heresy. You see the difference? And you could offer a correction without sitting in judgment of his magisterium as if you're a higher authority. You see the difference? This is why it's important that we understand the difference between judging, dissenting, correcting, criticizing. And so if you're going to be involved in these discussions, if you're going to come into the arena of YouTube and produce videos where you're going to throw in your lot with a particular side, and you're going to comment and you're going to offer solutions, at the very least, understand just the basic parameters of the discussion, what these various terms mean, and also some historical facts related to them, what the church says we can, and then what the church says we can't do. All right, so I am going to continue here in just a second. I'm going to step away, grab me some coffee, and also correct my camera lens here because it's not focusing. It's looking a little blurred. So I'm going to fix that for just a second, and then step away and come right back, and we'll resume with the rest of the video. Give me 1 second here. Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not.
Fortunately, at maximusinstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information.
Are you a Catholic thinking about converting to Eastern Orthodoxy? Or are you a Protestant discerning whether or not to become Catholic or Eastern Orthodox? If so, I have the book just for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy. It engages all of the arguments the Eastern Orthodox use against the Catholic Church. I respond to all of them. I show that they are in error, and in fact, they're inconsistent, because the things that Orthodox are objecting to are in fact found in their own tradition. So the fullness of the faith can only be found in the Catholic Church. Check out the book right now at shop.catholic.com for your copy today.
All right, I'm back, and it looks like the camera is better, and I have my coffee. One other additional point to mention here about correcting. A correction can also be done not only without accusing the Pope of heresy, but also without dissenting against the teaching. That's actually possible. In fact, this is what Dona Veritatis refers to in that document that's, again, written for this very situation. If you want to know the basic parameters of this discussion, I mean, definitely start with that document, because this is what it's written for by the magisterium, so it's authoritative. It's not just my opinion. But what it does is you could, in very rare cases, correct the Pope. But what it instructs individuals to do is, first of all, to do so privately. Now, could you express some of those publicly? The document seems to kind of guard against that. But at the very least, you could say that I have difficulties with this particular teaching. I'm struggling with understanding how it is true in light of this. If you want to consider that maybe correction, you can do that publicly. But simply saying, the Pope is wrong about this and he needs to fix it. Actually, Dona Veritatis says if you're going to take that approach, you need to do that privately rather than publicly. You need to avoid going to social media. So what Canon 212 is talking about is expressing your opinion. You can certainly express an opinion that's different than correcting the Pope. That's certainly different than dissenting. That's certainly different than judging the Pope. Right. So once we understand the differences in these terms, what we can and can't do, what the historical realities for these various situations are and aren't, then we have a better grasp of the situation, and we won't come along and offer some kind of solution that for anybody who's informed seems like, a KJV guy coming along and correcting theologians on the Greek New Testament by just saying, hey, the KJV was good enough for Paul, therefore it should be good enough for you guys, right? Okay, so let's go to the question of John the 22nd. I know I've dealt with it at length, but just for those who have not seen those videos, I'm going to tackle it again since it comes up in this video. All right, so I'm going to share my screen so that we can see it and begin here.
And there are examples of popes making material heresy or heretical statements in the past. And then, of course, those being corrected. In the case of Pope John the 22nd, I believe, he had made statements to the effect that souls, after they die, don't receive the beatific vision until after the final judgment, which is not quite right. And certain theologians and probably members of the Curia and the Magisterium offered some correction to that, at which point.
All right, I'm actually going to go over the question of John the 22nd in even more detail in the future. I know I've done a lot of videos on it, but there are some more things to consider. But let me just address what Brian is going over here. Okay, he's bringing this up as precedent for what is taking place with Cardinal Burke, right? Because that's the whole purpose of this video, is Cardinal Burke and what's taking place there. And the video is, can a cardinal correct the Pope? And as precedent for this, he brings up the issue of John the 22nd. Well, I certainly agree the question of Pope John the 22nd and the theologians in Paris and even some bishops and cardinals who had corrected him. I certainly agree that is precedent for correcting the Pope whenever he says something that is not in his teaching authority. But that's the context, right? John the 22nd wasn't teaching heresy. He wasn't even teaching at all. These were comments that he made outside of his magisterium. They were his personal opinion. And so, yes, if the Pope expresses a personal opinion outside of his magisterial capacity, of course you can correct that. Absolutely. And you can even do so publicly. That's different than correcting what he teaches authoritatively, right? Not the same thing. We need to understand just the basic parameters of this discussion and the basics of church history here. As I've demonstrated multiple times, the question of John the 22nd, according to not only John the 22nd, but even his critics, they all admit, all around, everyone involved, all around, both sides, all admit the Pope was not teaching this error, that he was merely privately putting it forward as a private opinion. And so, yeah, in that case, you could certainly correct him. But what does that have to do with Cardinal Burke? Brian seems to think that this maps onto the situation with Cardinal Burke, and it doesn't. Because as I've demonstrated with the case of Cardinal Burke is not correcting private comments of the Pope or private opinions of the Pope. Cardinal Burke is dissenting from, that is, opposing, dissenting, calling for opposition to magisterial teachings that are authoritative, both teachings and disciplines that are authoritative. Multiple times for over 8 years now. Brian seems to think that these are analogous, and they're not. And it once again just shows me the basics are not being appreciated here. So perhaps it's better to just maybe research those issues more before commenting on them. Because I don't think it's productive to come in, set up a straw man false dichotomy, and then offer a faux solution, and then accuse others of hypocrisy, which is, again, what we're going to see him doing. It's almost laughable. It would be, again, the KJV onlyists accusing these Greek New Testament scholars of being hypocrites and not aware of, this or that talking point for the KJV, and then honestly thinking, hey, here's my solution. The KJV was good enough for Paul, should be good enough for you. That settles the matter in the story. It's almost laughable. Okay, so let's go to the 5-minute 33-second mark. And here we're going to see him offering a faux solution from St. Thomas that doesn't solve anything because it doesn't actually apply to what we're talking about here. Okay.
And in my own attempts to try to understand this better and to do some reading, I came across a distinction that was very, very helpful from St. Thomas Aquinas, who in the second part of the Summa, I think it's question 33, he makes this distinction of the different kinds of correction that can be offered. The first kind, he says, is done in charity. It's done with gentleness, with the intention of bringing back your brother or sister who has fallen into error back into the fold. The second kind he describes as an act of justice, which is often done in the interest of the common good and can justifiably use measures like punishment to coerce the erring person back onto the right path. Now, between those two forms of correction, St. Thomas says that in the first form, that is charity, offered in reverence and gentleness, he says that charity is available to anyone. Anyone can exercise charity. Therefore, a subject can offer correction in charity, and a prelate can offer correction in charity. And in this case, the affair that we're discussing today, a prelate can offer a charitable correction to the Pope. In the second case, in which it is an act of justice, only superiors can exercise that kind of authority towards their subjects. And this is because a subject cannot authoritatively wield punishment as a means of correcting their superiors.
Okay, so he presents this as somehow it's a solution, and we're going to see him through the rest of the video offer this as a solution to the question. But again, it's not a solution because he doesn't actually understand what the debate is. Any heavy hitter in these discussions on papal dissent and papal heresy, we're all well aware of what Thomas said. Like, that's not a secret. This is nothing new. We're all aware. It's just that what he's saying is not very relevant to what we're discussing, because the situation is a little bit more nuanced than what St. Thomas is addressing there. And so we all agree with that distinction that St. Thomas made. Both sides agree. But we all just recognize it's not really relevant here. And I have to sincerely ask, why are we going to St. Thomas over and against the magisterium? Like, he says he was trying to research these issues and goes to St. Thomas. And I'm just thinking, you have many magisterial teachings that are authoritative, right? St. Thomas isn't actually a magisterial authority in the church. He is a great theologian, in my opinion, one of the greatest, if not the greatest theologian. Sneak peek, I do think he's the greatest theologian. But aside from that, St. Thomas is not binding on your conscience. The magisterium, however, is. So the magisterium does decisively settle the issues, whereas St. Thomas puts forward great opinions, but they're not binding on your conscience. My question is, why do people go to St. Thomas instead of the magisterium that has multiple documents explicitly about this question? I've shown no awareness on part of Brian with the document Dona Veritatis. This is what the document was written for. It's an entire document for this. Is there any awareness on his part, not only of Dona Veritatis, but again, the Eighth Ecumenical Council and numerous other magisterial documents? Let me give you just one. I know I've brought it up, but again, for anybody who hasn't seen me go over this before, let me show this again. Bear with me, those of y'all who have seen this ad nauseum. This is, again, magisterial, right? This is authoritative. This is from Humani Generis by Pope Pius XII before the Second Vatican Council. All right, so preconciliar. And here's what he says: nor must it be thought that what is expounded in encyclical letters does not of itself demand consent. Ooh, it demands consent. Since, in writing such letters, the popes do not exercise the supreme power of their teaching authority. In other words, if you think, hey, well, just because, because the pope didn't teach this infallibly, I don't have to hold to that teaching. The pope says that's wrong. You must not think that. For these matters are taught with the ordinary teaching authority, that is, they're taught non-infallibly, of which it is true to say, now here's the kicker, he who heareth you heareth me. That's a quote from Jesus. Whoa. Jesus is saying, or the Pope is saying, that Jesus' words apply to non-infallible teachings of the magisterium. In other words, if you are rejecting the non-infallible teachings of a pope or non-infallible teachings of a council, and the question, it is about a pope because it's about encyclical letters. He says, in that case, you are rejecting the voice of Jesus. This is why it's so important that we are not in dissent. Unfortunately, Cardinal Burke, in multiple instances, has expressed public dissent and calls for dissent. And according to Pius XII, that is violating this right here, because he is not hearing the voice of Jesus when he does so. And it continues, and generally what is expounded and inculcated in encyclical letters already for others appertains to Catholic doctrine. But if the supreme pontiffs, that's the Pope, in their official documents purposefully pass judgment on a matter up to that time under dispute, it is obvious that that matter, according to the mind and will of the pontiffs, cannot be any longer considered a question open to discussion among theologians. Wow. So if you want to say, hey, I can completely publicly dissent against these authoritative teachings of the church, think again. because Pope Pius XII, among many other magisterial instances, says you can't do this. Now, how many people are really adhering to this today? I mean, if this is even true of theologians, it's true of YouTubers who have no theology degrees, right? I mean, certainly. And it doesn't just apply to theologians, it also applies to other prelates as well, right? Cardinals, bishops. And that is substantiated again through Donum Veritatis. So I want to emphasize what we're seeing here is opposition to the voice of Jesus Christ whenever we oppose the magisterial teachings of the church, including popes. That's how grave this is. That's grave matter. That is why the church considers it grave matter to publicly dissent against non-infallible teachings of the church. Again, I'll do a whole stream going through this exhaustively, but I just wanted to wet your whistle here with just a little bit and simply raise the question, why are we going to St. Thomas Aquinas for an apparent solution here instead of actual documents of the magisterium that explicitly talk about this question? Why are we doing that? If not for perhaps we're unaware. And if we're unaware of the basic parameters, then my advice is just stay away from the questions publicly. Just talk about other things. But if you're going to weigh in on these things and you're going to make judgments on these things and people in these discussions, then certainly be aware of the basics. Okay, so I also want to point out with the case of St. Thomas Aquinas that I think perhaps Brian is missing here. Aquinas is referring to private corrections, not public corrections for the most part. He does raise the instance of Peter and Paul. In that case, he was Paul was correcting the hypocrisy of Peter, not his teachings. Right. So anybody who says, hey, the case of, Peter and Paul, Paul rebuked Peter, therefore we can say that the Pope teaches heresy and rebuke him for heresy. Yeah, no, no. Peter didn't teach heresy. Peter was engaging in hypocrisy, and Paul corrected that hypocrisy. That has absolutely nothing to do with discussions about papal heresy and correcting papal heresy, and if there can be papal heresy, right? Okay. So I do want to bring out that point. And again, I want to emphasize that correcting a superior in charity, which is what Thomas is doing there, and especially in private, is not the same as publicly dissenting. Dissenting would be an actual repudiation and rejection of that teaching that is in question. Thomas does not allow for public dissent. Show me one place in Aquinas where he allows for public dissent against authoritative teachings of the church. You will not find it. It's not there. Even if you did, it's not really relevant because we have more authoritative teachings here, and that is, actual documents of the magisterium that weigh in on this question. But if for some reason St. Thomas Aquinas is what settles this for you and not the magisterium, which would be very odd. If for some reason that's the case, again, show me where Aquinas allows for public dissent. He doesn't. So to bring up Thomas Aquinas in these discussions is outrageously irrelevant, in my opinion. Okay, let's go to the 7-minute, 24-second mark, where Brian is going to comment further on the question. And he seems to think, he's going to, again, put forward this false dichotomy and then offer Aquinas as the solution to this false dichotomy. Let me show it.
We go to survey different statements from councils and canon law, which are often the part of the tool chest of those that are engaging in debate about this online. We can use that distinction to kind of cut through and to clarify and to harmonize these various sometimes seemingly contradictory statements. One that is often used.
Let me stop there. I want to say again, these are not seemingly contradictory statements. And he's going to explicitly mention what these are: Canon 212 and Canon 1373. There is no even apparent contradiction. What is happening here is that Brian just doesn't understand what is being discussed. So for him, it looks like there's an apparent contradiction, and he's going to offer Aquinas as the solution. But it's like, no, there's actually no tension there to begin with. You're just not understanding the basic parameters. What's happening is we're getting our wires crossed, and we're getting confused because we're not making basic distinctions about terms like dissent, criticism, correction, judging, things like that. That's kind of what's going on here. Let's go to the 7-minute, 43-second mark, and he's going to dive into these two questions or these two canons, Canon 212 and Canon 1373, both canons that I discuss at length on this channel.
Among those who justify their criticisms of the magisterium or of the Pope, especially more recently with the Francis pontificate, is Canon 212, that says that the lay faithful have the right and the duty to express their opinions to the magisterium. And it even goes on to say that this doesn't have to be done merely and privately. It can be done in public for the good of the church.
Right. So again, I've brought up the question of Canon 212 numerous times because it does show that we can raise our concerns and even opinions. But what Brian seems to be missing is that this does not map onto the discussion that is taking place right now with Cardinal Burke, because Cardinal Burke is not merely expressing his opinion. Cardinal Burke has publicly dissented against the magisterium. It's also not relevant to other questions such as John XXII and other discussions that are taking place surrounding papal heresy, because accusing the Pope of heresy is not the same as expressing your opinion. It's not the same thing, right? We just need to understand the basics here. Let me go to Canon 212 just for those who haven't read it, because he didn't actually read it to us. Canon 212, he's referring specifically to, excuse me, paragraph 3 here. According to the knowledge, competence, and prestige which they possess. By the way, did you notice that caveat? According to the knowledge, competence, and prestige. So based on one's knowledge and competence in this area. So if a person lacks knowledge and competence, they probably don't meet this canon, right? Okay. They have the right and even at times the duty to manifest to their sacred pastors, so like to their priest, to their bishop, their opinion on matters which pertain to the good of the church, and to make their opinion known to the rest of the Christian faithful. Now, implied in making your opinion known to the rest of the Christian faithful would be something public, right? I mean, I doubt very seriously I have the rest of the Christian faithful's email at home. You know what I mean? Like, I can't email everybody privately and say, hey, here's my opinion. So when you make known your opinion to the rest of the Christian faithful, that implies public, right? So not just merely expressing your opinion to your sacred pastor in private, but making your opinion known publicly to the rest of the faithful without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals. Did you catch that? That's a caveat we don't often catch in Canon 212. Without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals, with reverence towards their pastors. We constantly mess up on that one. Think here of Timothy Gordon. And attentive to common advantage and the dignity of persons. We're missing that one with Pope Francis, aren't we? Okay, so all Canon 212, paragraph 3, allows you to do is make your opinion known either to your pastor or to the rest of the faithful. It does not allow you to dissent from the magisterium. Not the same thing. I can express that, in my opinion, this teaching of the Pope is very hard for me to reconcile with this other teaching. You could express that publicly. Maybe not always the wisest thing to do, but I could see it. But that is different than saying this teaching of the Pope is heresy, or this teaching of the Pope is in error and I oppose it and you should also oppose it. That's dissent. You don't get to do that according to actual teachings of the church in Humani Generis, Donum Veritatis, Eighth Ecumenical Council, and so on. Okay, so Canon 212 does not allow for what Cardinal Burke is doing, because again, Cardinal Burke is not merely just expressing his opinion. Cardinal Burke is saying, this isn't magisterial, 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 this is ultra vires. You don't have to assent to this. You don't have to obey that. You don't have to obey this. You don't have to assent to that. I've documented multiple instances where he's doing this, of authoritative teachings and judgments of the Pope. That's not Canon 212. That's a violation of bonum veritatis, humani generis, and so on and so forth. Okay, now he sets up Canon 212 for one side, doesn't understand it, doesn't see how it doesn't even map onto these debates really. Sets that up, and now he's going to set up Canon 1373 in opposition to that. And he's going to say, look, it looks like there's a seemingly a contradiction here, but there can't be. Here's my solution from St. Thomas. Okay, let me share my screen. Let's see him comment on Canon 1733. Let's go to the, let's see, it is the 807 timestamp.
But also in the spirit of what St. Thomas taught earlier, it has to be done with reverence, with gentleness, and with charity. And it also needs to be tempered by Canon 1373, which is the other side of this debate, which is often invoked to establish that you can't criticize the Pope, which says that you can't incite hatred towards the magisterium or towards ordinaries because of some decision or some teaching that they have exercised with the authority of their office. Now, again, Canon 212 is often cited by people who want...
All right. Wow. I amazed that this is the takeaway that Brian has from Canon 1373. He says that Canon 1373 somehow indicates, according to some people at least, that you can't criticize the Pope under any circumstance, which he obviously rejects and thinks that that's not accurate, right? To which I would agree with him, right? That is not accurate. But who are these people who actually say that? I've never, anybody who has ever brought up Canon 1373, I've never heard them use that to say you can't criticize the Pope. So who are these people? This is a straw man. So we're setting up a false dichotomy, and then we're going to come in with a faux solution from St. Thomas, and this is not productive because it doesn't actually appreciate anything that's really being discussed here. Nobody says Canon 1373 is somehow forbids criticism of the Pope. Name me one person who says that. Maybe you'll find some random on Twitter who says that. I'm talking about some actual person who's really involved in these discussions. Show me like one person who says that. They don't exist. Okay, well, let me actually show you what Canon 1373 says. He didn't show it to y'all, so I'm going to do that for him. What I find unfortunate with Brian is what Brian often does is he will reference something and then he'll give you his interpretation of it all, and it often doesn't map onto the actual thing. And what the difference is, what I'll do is I'll actually show you on the screen what this says, and you can fact check me. Like I literally just showed you humani generis earlier. I'm now showing you Canon 1373. I showed you Canon 212. I've read to you from the Acts of the Eighth Ecumenical Council many times. That way you can fact check me. And you're not getting my interpretation of those things. You're literally seeing the thing itself. And then when I comment on it, you can say, hold on, wait, no, Michael, that doesn't map on to what you actually just read me. And then you can critique it. He gives us, 1373, but doesn't actually quote it. So let me do that. I'm sharing my screen now. And here's what it says. A person who publicly incites hatred or animosity against the apostolic see. Now, is criticizing a person the same as inciting hatred or animosity? Of course not. There's an important difference, right? I can criticize you without inciting hatred or animosity. So this canon has nothing to do with criticizing, and he agrees it has nothing to do with it, but the point is, nobody else thinks it actually has anything to do with criticizing the Pope. Nobody thinks that.
So a person who publicly incites hatred or animosity against the apostolic see or the ordinary because of some act of ecclesiastical office or duty, or who provokes disobedience against them. Disobedience is to be punished by interdict or other just penalties. Now, this part does apply to Cardinal Burke, unfortunately, as well as Taylor Marshall and many others, right? Kennedy Hall, Timothy Gordon, all of those guys. It applies to all of them. They do provoke disobedience. And I would argue some of them incite hatred. I don't think Cardinal Burke incites hatred against the apostolic see. I don't believe that. I think he means well. I think he is well intentioned, and he would be horrified at the notion of inciting hatred against the Holy See. So I don't think that applies to Cardinal Burke. I do think that applies to Taylor Marshall and Timothy Gordon and others like that. Now, but again, provoking disobedience against the Holy See, that is a criticism of Cardinal Burke, because over and over and over since 2015 at the earliest, there might be something earlier than that, I don't know, he tells us this document is a magisterial. Amoris Laetitia is a magisterial. I forget the other documents. I documented them the other day in the other in the stream. He says the death penalty decision isn't magisterial and authoritative. He says that Traditionis Custodes is ultra vires and therefore not authoritative. We are free to reject both it and also the death penalty decision, as well as many other instances that I documented here on the show. That is provoking disobedience against the Holy See. Like, if that is not provoking disobedience, what is that? That's the definition of provoking disobedience. You're disobeying lawful authority, whether in teachings or governing commands. In Burke's case, he does both. So Canon 1373 does actually, it is a legitimate criticism of what Cardinal Burke is doing, but Brian doesn't seem to understand how, because he seems to think that people are just saying that Burke can't criticize the Pope, and they're using Canon 1373 for that. Yeah, no. And who actually does that? Nobody. This is a straw man. All right, so now he's going to give us his faux solution here from his reading of St. Thomas, which is, again, kind of laughable. Well, let's see. Let's go to the 8-minute 57 mark and begin. Somebody said it's muted, no sound. Okay, let me start that over. On occasion that happens, we're going to start at the 8-minute 40-second mark.
Their office. Now, again, Canon 212 is often cited by people who want to publicly criticize and even condemn prelates and ordinaries and the Pope, whereas Canon 1373 is often cited by those who want to say that you can't criticize under any circumstances bishops or especially the Pope. And I think St. Thomas Aquinas's distinction helps us to understand how both can be true.
Somebody's still saying there's no audio. Are y'all still not hearing audio, or are y'all hearing that? Please let me know this second time around. Do y'all have audio, or is there no audio? Let me play that clip once more. Okay, y'all are saying you do have audio now. Oh, okay, good deal. But some people are still telling me they didn't have audio. Maybe there was just kind of a delay there. Let's watch it one more time. Okay.
They have exercised with the authority of their office. Now, again, Canon 212 is often cited by people who want to publicly criticize and even condemn prelates and ordinaries and the Pope, whereas Canon 1373 is often cited by those who want to say that you can't criticize under any circumstances bishops or especially the Pope. And I think St. Thomas Aquinas's distinction helps us to understand how both can be true. The lay faithful and subjects can correct their superiors when it's done according to the first form of correction that St. Thomas identifies, which is done in charity and out of love and gentleness with the intention of bringing their brother or their sister back into the fold and moving away from their correction. But what subjects can't do is wield a kind of correction that depends on justice or is informed by justice, which can then use coercive measures like punishment.
Okay, so let me stop there. And once again, I know I've kind of mentioned this before already on this stream, but I'm going to repeat it again. And people always ask me, Michael, why do you always repeat yourself? Here's why: because I can repeat myself 50 times in the same stream, and then still a ton of commenters come away not understanding the point. And so I've noticed that it's important to reiterate and emphasize certain points for people to digest them. And since this is still something that the average person doesn't seem to be grasping, in the comment section, and even YouTubers like Brian don't seem to be getting it, it's something that I think I have to repeat multiple times. So once again, what we're seeing is a false dichotomy. He is misunderstanding Canon 212 and people who are using it, misunderstanding Canon 1373 and some people who are using it, saying, hey, it looks like there's a contradiction, but there can't be a contradiction. Here's my faux solution from St. Thomas. No, it doesn't work that way. I use both canons, Canon 212 and 1373, but I use them for other points than what is being brought up here. I use Canon 1373, not to say you can't criticize the Pope, but to say that you should not be provoking disobedience against him or inciting animosity against him. And I use Canon 212 to show that, yeah, you can publicly express your opinion and some of your concerns and even criticisms of the Pope. I use that to demonstrate that, so that I give a balanced approach. So unfortunately, the solution from St. Thomas, though I agree with the distinction of St. Thomas, it doesn't apply to this discussion. And what happens is, whenever someone like Brian comes along and attempts to offer his thoughts on this without really knowing what it is, like going in half-cocked, it doesn't seem to be productive because it muddies the waters. And what I fear is that the average person who watches his video, who doesn't know about the issues, would come away thinking, oh, wow, this is just so reasonable. Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate this. This is totally awesome what you're saying. And it's like, for anybody sitting back and actually knows what's going on, it's laughable how irrelevant these thoughts really are to anybody. This video just unfortunately wasn't productive for anyone who is trying to get to the bottom of the truth in the question of papal criticism, papal heresy, and so on. Let's go to the 9-minute 36-second mark. Let me actually address this because I want to guard against this. Amber says, I just see her in the chat, Michael, you're ruining Brian for me. You are opening my eyes to the misinformation out there. I love this channel and trust his opinion because he was moderate, but I can't watch him anymore. Let me guard against that. Look, I'm not saying it, Amber, I'm not, and for anybody else who's getting this impression, I am not saying Brian has nothing to offer on YouTube. That's not what I'm saying. So if you think that you just can't go to his channel or something, no, I'm not saying that. I'm sure he has plenty of productive things to offer. What I'm saying is, whenever Brian is weighing in on these questions of what's going on in the church, or the question of papal criticism, papal heresy, or some issue related to Bishop Strickland, Bishop Burke, or, church politics or something like that, or just some finer points of theology, yeah, maybe that's not the best channel. But I'm not saying that he has nothing to offer you. I'm sure he has plenty of things that he can offer you on his channel that are very productive. And so, no, I don't want you to think that you just can't, watch people who get it wrong in some areas, because I'm sure I get it wrong in other areas. That doesn't mean that, I don't have anything to offer. And Jamie says your tone towards Brian is very condescending. That's interesting, especially given that Brian accuses people in this discussion of hypocrisy. I don't see the criticism of that kind of tone and behavior. But yeah, okay, if you think that, then, I apologize. I'm not trying to be condescending. But what I am trying to do is show people that if you don't know about the matters. You don't need to use your large platform to comment on the situation, because you will end up muddying the waters and doing more damage than good. And that really needs to be addressed. If you think that that's condescending, I'm sorry that you took it that way. Okay, let's go to the 9-minute 36-second mark, where Brian, oddly enough, ends up agreeing with a point that I often make. I don't think he realizes it, but he agrees with a point that I make. But this very point that he agrees with actually undermines Cardinal Burke, and he doesn't connect the dots and see how. And I'm going to connect the dots for you. Somebody says Michael just just lives in the South where they talk slower. That's funny. Okay, so maybe that's it. I don't know. Let me grab this comment too. Mr. Lofton, like many others, is spending time highlighting perceived criticism of others rather than building up the church and contributing to saving souls. I would not classify this as educating the people. Mr. Lofton, and they misspelled my name, in the past had some inaccuracies himself. Yeah, again, I don't think you understand the basics of this discussion and the parameters thereof. So maybe you might want to maybe revisit this in the future when you're ready to listen. Okay, so let's and thank you, Loyal. I always find you very charitable in your analysis. I appreciate that. Okay, let's go to where he makes a good observation here, but doesn't connect the dots with how this is a criticism of Cardinal Burke. Okay.
So if you're going to criticize the Pope or your bishops for something that maybe is worthy of criticism, in the hopes that it will be a sort of an unpleasant experience for them, or a form of punishment where you are inflicting something on them that will force a correction out of them, like maybe withholding money during a charitable appeal, or appealing to Catholic journalistic outlets to try to expose them for their corruption. These are measures that a subject can't really employ towards their superior.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with this. Brian just doesn't see how this then undermines what Cardinal Burke is doing. In the video, Brian sides with Cardinal Burke, thinks that he's not doing anything wrong, but this is where, again, the ignorance comes into play. If he knew better and listened to what others are saying in criticism of Cardinal Burke, he would know this. Cardinal Burke has resorted to the pressures of social media to put pressure on Pope Francis. The very thing that Brian just admitted is condemnable behavior that we cannot participate in, Cardinal Burke and others have done. Burke, Mueller, Strickland, Schneider, a lot of the guys that he defends do this very thing. That is the criticism, one of them at least, that I've brought up. And it's so interesting that Brian agrees with the principle, but then doesn't see how it applies to these individuals. Need I remind you once again of 2016, resorting to putting public pressure on the Pope by putting the dubia out there in public. Cardinal Burke, among others, did it again 2023, 2 days before the Synod, also endorsing and putting forwards to wild books out there, just coming up with wild accusations against the Synod on synodality. Cardinal Mueller, among others, Strickland, and again, Schneider, doing some of the same behavior. I don't understand why Brian doesn't see how this principle is being violated by these individuals, and thus the basis for others who say, hey, you can't do that, and you need to assent to the magisterium. Okay, so I found that to be interesting. Let's go maybe to the 10-minute, 15-second mark, and pick it up from there. Share my screen. Okay.
Now, in the question of Cardinal Burke, He has been accused by many of the people jumping to the defense of Pope Francis by denouncing him for having been unfaithful or divisive or hubristic or whatever the particular accusation may be. But to be honest, I'm not aware of anything that Cardinal Burke has said or done which could be described in the manner that of St. Thomas's second form of correction, that according to justice. From what I've seen of Cardinal Burke, he's always done so with great reverence for the office of the Pope, out of gentleness and fraternal admiration. And
Okay, yeah, this is where he's missing it. He has Thomas Aquinas, and what Aquinas is saying, he has that as the guiding principle, and that's it. He doesn't have Dona Veritatis in mind. He doesn't have Humani Generis in mind. He doesn't have the Eighth Ecumenical Council in mind. He doesn't even have proper understandings of Canon 1373 or Canon 212 in mind. So with a better understanding of those, he would then, and also with better understanding of what Burke has done, Cardinal Burke has done, I then think that he would have a better appreciation for some of the criticisms that have been made. This is why it's important not to just jump on YouTube, go and throw in your lot with a certain side and start criticizing others, accusing them of hypocrisy and all sorts of things, and then offering faux solutions, when in reality this just does nothing but muddy the waters. Now again, I'm not going to repeat the whole history of the concerns with Cardinal Burke. I recommend you go and watch the video that I did last week. Let me pull it up just so I can get the name of it, so you can go and watch it yourself. It will demonstrate what I've said here by way of criticism. It's called Was Cardinal Burke Evicted from Rome by Pope Francis? I'll put a link to it in the show notes. I go over not an exhaustive list, but a fair amount of issues related to Cardinal Burke, where he is violating some of the principles that that Brian agrees cannot be violated. So where does that leave him in relation with Cardinal Burke? Perhaps we'll get a follow-up video. Okay, let's go to the 10-minute 50-second mark and start there. 1 second. Okay.
love. But some people are so offended by the fact that a subject would correct the Pope in any way, shape, or form that they just assume that his intention must be malicious. And this is something you just absolutely cannot do. For example, I might be in a conversation with somebody in which we're discussing some prudential governing decision that the Pope or any superior or any ordinary of the church might have made. And I could say, I don't think it was right for him to do that. Now, the problem with evaluating a statement like that is that it could have been expressed out of genuine concern and love for the church and the one who is perhaps being corrected or criticized in this case. Or it could be something that is done out of malice or a desire to impose punishment upon the superior. And the problem is that from the outside, if you're just someone who heard me or someone else make a statement like that, you actually can't really judge what my intention was for making that statement. You would have to be able to judge my heart, which is specifically the kind of judgment that Jesus condemns in the Gospels, because it's a judgment made without the knowledge that is necessary to make that judgment.
That's an interesting comment about a judgment made without the knowledge necessary to make the judgment. Okay, well, hold on. Let me fix my camera again. 1 second. All right, I'm gonna have to adjust the settings on that later on, but I apologize for it. Yeah, so look, I agree that we can't judge the intentions of Cardinal Burke and say that they're malicious. And so, look, if somebody's out there doing that, I don't think that's right. I don't think that we're in a position to determine that Cardinal Burke has malice in his intentions, and I've seen enough from Cardinal Burke to think otherwise. In fact, again, Cardinal Burke and I have some mutual friends in common and they assure me Cardinal Burke intends well. They agree that Cardinal Burke is wrong, but they assure me he intends well, and I have no reason to doubt what they're saying. I so I want to emphasize that if somebody is saying that, I don't think that's right. I think we need to back away from taking that approach. Let's just keep it objective. Let's not try to discern his intentions. Let's give him, let's give Cardinal Burke the benefit of the doubt. I still think that there's plenty of reasons to do that. So unless something severely changes, I don't think we should be doing that. But I don't know who those people are. But yeah, I don't agree with it if it's happening. But now here again, Brian frames it as, criticizing the Pope. And I just once again want to reiterate, but that's not all Burke is doing. Cardinal Burke is doing more than just criticizing the Pope. I don't have an issue with criticizing the Pope. It is him publicly dissenting and provoking others to disobey the authentic teachings and judgments of the magisterium. That's the issue. But I also agree it's wrong to judge people's intentions. But I just hope that Brian uses that same approach with Pope Francis, because I will say this: from some of the videos that I've seen from Brian, I haven't seen all of his videos, but I've seen a few. From some of the videos that I've seen, I don't get the impression that Brian approaches Pope Francis in the way he approaches Cardinal Burke. He's very eager and willing to give Cardinal Burke the best interpretation and assume the best of intentions. I'm not so sure that that's the case with his approach to Pope Francis, though. And I would just simply say he needs to take his advice and apply that to the Pope, because frankly, the Pope deserves that more than a cardinal. Okay, so let's now look at the 12-minute mark, where again we're going to see the setting up of a straw man. Share my screen, and here we go.
But again, everything that I've seen from Burke seems to suggest that it is the kind that can be offered from a subject to his superior. Now, for those who insist that Burke deserves what he got and that he should be condemned, and they're carting out all of their evidence against him, and denouncing him quite personally and publicly in many cases, I think that there's a great irony in this tactic that needs to be recognized in the context of this conversation, because the thing that they believe that Burke has done, which is unjustly criticizing his superior, is the very thing that they are doing to Burke himself. They say that he was uncharitable and divisive, and clearly, if they're familiar with St. Thomas's distinctions, that he was trying to use justice and punishment and undesirable effects to coerce the Pope into perhaps a position that he would have favored. And therefore, he deserves punishment. But what gives them the right to do the exact same thing that they say he was deserving of punishment for? They're correcting Cardinal Burke, who is their superior ecclesiastically, by trying to denounce him and express disapproval of him in a manner that is completely unbecoming. So you can't say that Burke has no right to offer any form of correction towards the Pope, and especially that form which is inappropriate when it's a subject towards his superior, and then turn around and do the exact same thing towards Cardinal Burke, who is your superior. The hypocrisy of that is just obnoxiously conspicuous.
Oh, wow. Some pretty strong words there. Obnoxiously conspicuous, hypocrisy. Those are some pretty massive claims and judgments here. So we have to make sure that we know what we're talking about to make those claims. I'm not saying it's wrong to accuse people of hypocrisy or being obnoxiously hypocritical. I think that that's fair game if it's true, but unfortunately, it's not true, because he is completely missing, again, the basic parameters here. All right, well, let's start with the issue of unjust criticism of the Pope. The criticism of Cardinal Burke is not that he unjustly criticized the Pope. That's the way he frames it is just, again, missing the mark here. The criticism of Cardinal Burke is that he is dissenting from the magisterium and publicly promoting and provoking disobedience against the Holy See in certain authoritative areas, both of teaching and matters of governance, which we saw Canon 1373, Donum Veritatis Humani Generis forbids. That's the criticism. Now he mentions irony here, and then again comes with accusations of hypocrisy based on the irony, but he has his wires crossed and tangled. And again, I've been trying this whole stream to untangle it, but if you have, I have my studio here, and I'm telling you, every time I have to move stuff around, I have to untangle like a million wires over here, and it can be done. It's tedious, it's boring, takes time. But it can certainly be done. And that's kind of what I'm doing with this video. It might be tedious. It might be, it might not be the most interesting thing, but then it sometimes just kind of has to be done. Brian has his wires crossed all over and jumbled up. And if that's true of Brian, I think that's also true of a lot of others, hence why I'm doing what I'm doing. Okay, really, there is no irony here. Cardinal Burke is not anyone's superior in any way that would require us to adhere to what he teaches or allows us to dissent from what he says. Okay, so that's the difference here. What's happening with Cardinal Burke is that he is dissenting against authoritative teachings of the Pope that are binding on his conscience, to which he owes religious submission of intellect and will, and to which he is not allowed to publicly dissent from or provoke others to disobedience. He is not allowed to do that. That's the issue. Cardinal Burke exercises zero authority in the magisterium right now. He has absolutely zero authority to bind your conscience, my conscience. Now, I might revere his opinion because he's a cardinal. I might revere his opinion because of his understanding of the Code of Canon Law in relation to marriages. I might revere his opinion significantly. But that doesn't mean that his view is binding on my conscience. However, Pope Francis's teachings that he is currently dissenting from are binding on our consciences. So this is a bad analogy that Brian, is making here. He's not our superior in any authoritative sense. He is our superior insofar as he's, a cardinal who has holy orders. He's a bishop. And so there's a moral authority there, certainly. And I would certainly recognize it. If I saw Cardinal Burke, I would kneel and kiss his ring, and certainly shows that respect that is owed to just him as just simply a successor of the apostles and a revered man who's an expert in canon law and so on. And so there is a moral authority there, but there is no actual teaching authority that is binding on our consciences. Whereas with Pope Francis, there is that teaching authority that is binding on our consciences. So there is no irony here. Brian just doesn't understand, again, the basic parameters of what's being discussed. And then he accuses people of hypocrisy, but the hypocrisy is based on ignorance. And he says it's just obnoxiously apparent. Well, no, the only thing obnoxiously apparent here is Brian's ignorance of the discussion. That's what is very manifest, I think, at this point. Let's go to the 1346 second mark. Wrapping it up here. Video's almost done.
So in summary, to answer the question, are there cases in which a superior like the Pope can be corrected by one of his subjects? In the case of Pope John the 22nd, that's clearly the case. And because the popes can be wrong about certain statements, correction is a worthwhile thing to exercise within the body of the church. But the form of correction that it takes depends on the relationship of superior to subject. If it's subject to a superior, there are limitations upon the manner of correction and the intention behind it. If it's the case of a superior to a subject, then more is available to them through the exercise of their authority. And again, as far as the Burke affair is concerned, it seems to me that Burke was always very careful to maintain obedience to the first form and not the second form, which is why when lay people jump online and start condemning him, first of all, I think they're wrong. And second of all, they become guilty of the very thing that they accuse him of.
Again, strong words. We become guilty. Okay. So couple points here. Once again, we're saying that Brian doesn't understand the debate is elsewhere. There's a lot of things going on in this debate. Can the Pope teach heresy in his magisterium? That's one factor in this debate. Another is, can an inferior publicly dissent from magisterial teachings? Not just merely criticize, but publicly dissent from magisterial teachings. That's another issue in this debate. Can an inferior publicly put pressure on the Pope with social media? That's another aspect to this debate. He doesn't seem to be understanding, though he does agree in the video that individuals shouldn't put pressure on the Pope through social media. And I would just connect the dots for him and say, yeah. And, that's exactly what Cardinal Burke, and among others, have done. So do you agree that they should not be doing that? I mean, I think we might need another YouTube video where he agrees with that. That's on him. I mean, he doesn't have to, but I'm just trying to connect the dots for y'all. Now, I found this also interesting because you remember in a previous video, Brian told us that, we should kind of avoid having our YouTube trials, with all these debates and discussions. But as I've pointed out, what Brian does is he bypasses the YouTube trial part and he just goes straight to issuing judgments. He doesn't even do the trial part. He just goes straight to, you guys are wrong. You guys are hypocrites. It's obnoxiously apparent that you're a hypocrite. It's wrong what you're doing. And it's ironic and blah, blah, blah. He's issuing these verdicts, these judgments. And then he's also issuing verdicts and judgments in favor of Burke. I don't see anything wrong with what he did according to the parameters of Thomas. And it's like, you're issuing these judgments without holding a trial and without actually hearing the evidence. And I don't think that's wise. At least people who are issuing YouTube trials are trying to weigh the evidence. At least that. There's that. But for somebody who just bypasses that, thinks that they know what they're talking about with actually even hearing all of the evidence first, and then issues judgments, that's not helpful. And that's very problematic, and again, muddies the waters. I'll also point out, again, notice how Brian seems to rush to the defense of Cardinal Burke, but I don't see him doing that with the Pope. I wonder why. And then one last point, again, I do think that Brian's video, if a person just watches the video and doesn't really know about the issues involved, they're going to come away thinking, wow, this is just great. Brian is just so balanced. This sounds so reasonable. This sounds so rational. And, he's so level-headed. And again, for anybody who's informed, this is almost comical that this is not rational. This is not level-headed. We're rushing to judgment when we haven't actually evaluated the arguments. For this reason, I just think that it's best if you don't have the time to do that. I get it. I understand. We all have things to do, but just avoid rushing to your YouTube channel to tell people how you think they're wrong and here's my solution. And you haven't really even heard what the evidence is. I would just avoid that. I think that would be probably the best course of action. Hopefully this kind of opens up our eyes to, some commentators out there, just, God bless them. They have great contributions elsewhere, but perhaps this kind of isn't their thing. But anyways, if you found this helpful and if you found this productive, let me know. Put it in the comment section. Let me know your thoughts about this. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, help me grow this channel so I can reach more people to help offset some of the confusion that other content creators are creating unintentionally, I'm sure. But there's a lot of confusion that they're creating. A lot of these guys are not theologians. They are not informed about the issues, but they rush to YouTube, comment on these things. they have sizable followers, and a lot of people end up going down the wrong path because they are being misled by ignorance and so forth. If you found this helpful in addressing that, hit the like and subscribe button so that you can help me grow the channel and reach more people to help offset some of this other stuff that we're seeing on YouTube. All right. And if you want to support me, patreon.com/reason and theology is a great place to do it. Or consider supporting me through the GoFundMe or the PayPal links there in the show notes. All right. Got plenty more content coming up soon. So stay tuned for more. We'll see you later.
Are you a Catholic thinking about converting to Eastern Orthodoxy? Or are you a Protestant discerning whether or not to become Catholic or Eastern Orthodox? If so, I have the book just for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy, and engages all of the arguments that Eastern Orthodox use against the Catholic Church. I respond to all of them. I show that they are in error, and in fact, they're inconsistent, because the things that Orthodox are objecting to are in fact found in their own tradition. So the fullness of the faith can only be found in the Catholic Church. Check out the book right now at shop.catholic.com for your copy today.